I'm reading from my completed memoir titled A Life Abandoned. A nurse deconstructs her daughter's overdose in an American era of despair. The excerpt I am reading takes place in a remote Alaskan Arctic village in November 2009, 2 months after my daughter's fatal polysubstance overdose. I am working there to provide primary care and to manage emergencies when they arise. The excerpt is taken from a subchapter titled Consciousness and begins with a dream Danielle had posted on Twin Cities Punk 3 years before her death in 2006. I had another zombie dream. What does it mean that I always end up giving up and offering myself to them or killing myself? A few posts later, she continues, we're afraid of zombies, of course. In the movies, everyone tries to survive as long as possible. Not me, no sir. That's the part I wonder at. I returned to the village where I had worked the previous year in the aftermath of a 15-year-old man's suicide by gunshot. At that time, I imagined the survivors of the suicide resided in an ill-fated land beyond a chasm that would protect me and mine. Now I returned within the crucible of my own grief in the hope that living and working in the bush would provide me solace, in part because personal tragedy is so commonplace in the remote settlements. No man, woman, nor child, the age of reason, does not know that sometimes people murder themselves. Several days after my arrival, I called my husband, Mike, who was at home with our son in St. Paul. When Mike answered, my vocal cords tightened as I murmured, yeah, it's me. I dreaded the 2-second delay in voice transmission that always tripped us up. During our Alaskan calls, Mike had a harder time than usual getting a word in edgewise. I began, I'm feeling fragile. I teared up while watching a daughter help her frail mother onto the exam table today. I couldn't staunch the self-pity, just knowing that Danielle won't be there to compensate when my body and mind begin running on low octane. Mike started to respond, but I preempted him. She sure wasn't thinking about us when she tossed back those pills. A long pause ensued as we waited, uncertain whose turn it was. I slowed my cadence to a trudge. We could never make anything better for her. What a terrible bind to feel so responsible, yet so powerless. Mike relived his regrets. I could feel her going down after the second failed fistula surgery, but I couldn't cross the bridge to keep her from spinning away. I sympathized. I tried to be her friend, but I feel like I failed her as a parent. You know that I gave the children over to God 4 years ago. I was feeling neurotic, always on the hot seat to come up with a winning strategy. It all ended so catastrophically for my faith and optimism. I am angry every day at God, Danielle, people from the church, friends. I spent 5 years praying to God to save my daughter, and it didn't work. She's dead and gone. That case is closed. He paused to recover from his loathsome words. Resuming with more assurance, he declared, now I'm redefining God as a force who is suffering with us instead of saving us. Relief washed over me. I hated that Mike had paid so dearly for a belief in God that is contingent on divine acts of beneficence. I hadn't condoned the theological bargain he'd cut to stay afloat after Danielle's first overdose in 2004 for fear of what came to be. His bitterness toward God and members of the church, if his prayers went unanswered. He'd known that her first OD might not be her last. For my part, growing up in the shadow of the Holocaust had disabused me of any notion that God plays favorites. Mike continued his lamentation. Our friends mean well, but nothing they say helps. No one can understand what we're going through. Some days I think I can never be friends with old friends again. Mike speculated. If we pushed her harder to get psychiatric help, maybe it would have changed the outcome. I defended our efforts using behavioral psychology. We were like rats pushing a bar for treats. She rewarded us richly until she left home. After the 2004 OD, we showered her with suggestions, study English literature, but she didn't pursue the university programs we researched. Volunteer in a developing country, but she rejected helping the needy. Attend Emotions Anonymous meetings. When she hadn't acted on our suggestions, we stopped pushing the bar, a classic case of learned helplessness. She'd made it clear she'd find her own way. Mike generously offered, "It was your optimism over the years that kept her going. You were the one who advised her against applying for Social Security disability benefits when she floated the idea in 2004. You showed her confidence. You showed confidence that she can make it on her own," which was exactly what she wanted and needed to hear. Dumbing down disability had been a cinch. At 21, Danielle was too young to take on the label of disabled. We'd bide our time. From my experience with patients, I'd seen that disability benefits are best reserved for young people with globally diminished function and few financial resources. State support could have even perpetuated her dependence on the system, attenuating her belief in her own competence. As Mike and I struggled to make sense of what happened to Danielle, we'd been influenced by 20th century Freudianism that insisted that personalities established by age 5 in the context of early life experiences within family. Until the day she died, I'd been convinced that the adult Danielle had the same potential as a child we so carefully tended. I hadn't believed her when she would say, "I can't do that, Mom," in response to my suggestions that would advance her progress toward full-fledged adulthood. In the months following that conversation with Mike, I sought out 21st century neuroscientific research that altered my interpretation of what had happened to Danielle. Her brain had changed, termed neuroplasticity, in response to life experiences, especially harmful events, including a sexual assault at 16. Her prefrontal lobes, the seat of the thinking mind and executive function, had been wired negatively from the beginning, generating a foundational pessimism in which perceived failures and traumatic events furrowed her brain's fatalistic pathways ever deeper, causing her to lose faith in herself and hope for her future. On the Minnesota State High School writing sample, she'd scored a perfect 6 on an essay on the glories of flying, which reflected the high value she placed on freedom. But by the time she was 20, she'd become imprisoned by her labile moods and restrictive phobias, including taxi drivers, malls, and restaurant seats facing away from the door. Too late, I got it. Her awareness of her evolving limitations in response to harmful experiences had caused her to jam the brakes on our expectations so as to avoid the intolerable anxiety our hope engendered. Yet even without all that knowledge, I had intuited in this early conversation with Mike that evening in the village that we were not to blame. I knew that Mike had a fatalistic turn of mind and it would require convincing. We acted out of our best intentions for Danielle. Friends and strangers have honored our courage in speaking out about her overdose. Her death has already benefited others. Our loss has reminded everyone of the tenuous hold they have on the ones they love. Do we have any other choice than to grow, to put the whole parental conundrum in the soul bank? Mike reacted vehemently. Growth? Isn't it dishonest to pretend that we've accepted and transcended this? Isn't it premature? We have to begin sometime. Why not now? You've already initiated the healing with your reminders that she might have been an adolescent suicide, but for the negotiations and compromises we'd made, that she was a wild child with her volatile negativity and intense desire to live authentically. Sounding defeated, he asked rhetorically, "What's the use of all this consciousness?" I was too depleted to continue sparring. Quickly, I said goodbye. Gotta go, gotta do a home visit, I love you. At 8 p.m., Marion, a homebound elder, phoned to ask whether I was still planning to visit her. Too drained to invent an excuse, I told her my daughter recently overdosed, which we believe was a suicide. I've been delayed by a phone conversation with my husband. Marion firmly assured me the visit could wait another day. When I asked her why she had requested the visit, she mentioned problems breathing. I told her I'd be right over. I reviewed her health summary and packed some steroids and an antibiotic, figuring that her chronic obstructive lung disease was the likely culprit. I stepped out into the chill night. The Big Dipper's pointer stars teased my eyes toward the North Star overhead. Inside the ambulance, I distractedly searched my pockets for keys, forgetting that they're left in the ignition, just begging to be joyridden. When I turned over the engine, the public radio station popped on. Because it was Pledge Week, the locals' favorite musical genre was broadcast live from Friends Church. With a steady thrum of a guitar behind them, wavering voices extolled their love of Jesus. Because street names are superfluous in the village, I made a few wrong turns before finding the, quote, blue house near the tank, per Marion's directions. I entered the mud porch where pungent tobacco smoke invaded my nasal passages. Through the crack in the door to the house proper, I called out to Marion, asking her to put out her cigarette. Not an ideal way to strike up a relationship. A diminutive elderly woman beckoned to me from the living room, arms raised high in a V. She embraced me, exclaiming, "I'm Bee, Marion's friend and helper. She told me about your daughter. I lost 3 of my 15 to it." I peered down into Bee's twinkling eyes and set in her craggy face. The TV and evangelist's audible cadences prepped me for the answer to my next question. How did you manage to deal with the loss of 3 sons? Jesus, and he will help you too. Marion lay half reclining in bed in a cluttered room the size of a walk-in closet. I could see by her long blonde gray hair, hazel eyes, and high cheekbones that Marion had been an Inupiaq beauty. I felt her forehead, no fever. Her breath was shallow and quiet at 40 respirations a minute. "Show me your Novak," I said. She spit into an empty juice bottle, the 4th hawker I'd seen that day. Her frothy white sputum suggested chronic lung disease with perhaps a touch of heart failure. Without an x-ray machine, I had to rely on signs and symptoms. The Inupiaq aren't self-conscious about secretions, perhaps because noses run so frequently in the cold. And traditionally, the Arctic has been paperless. Mothers once sucked boogers out of their babies' noses. And given the price of Kleenex here, some still do. After auscultating Marion's lungs and heart, I asked her about her children. She'd birthed 16. Several had died during infancy and childhood from infectious diseases. When I asked how many were living, she named each one, touching her right index finger onto the finger pads of her left hand for a tally of 6. Because at one time elders had little use for numbers, they sometimes don't count in their heads. Marion was battling 10 and 16 to my 1 and 2. I tried to crunch the suffering variance between the 2 ratios. So much depends on the mother. For me, having 6 remaining children would have been better than 1. But I was in no position to grasp the soul-sucking loss of 10. Marion's inhaler held a breakfast confused her, so I reviewed each one. She complained that the health aides never deliver her medicines, and I gently explained that that's not their job. That's what your grandsons need to do. "They don't have transportation to clinic," she said. Like families in the lower 48, young people without purpose sometimes can't find motivation to help out at home. I didn't say this to her, I said it in the text. Now Marion questioned me about Danielle. I was no longer just the Nulag Mu, that is white, nurse treating her lung disease. The kindness in her eyes facilitated my shift from caregiver to care receiver. Until that moment, I hadn't realized how much I needed a mother's touch. She listened intently to the short version of Danielle's story. With typical Inupiaq hospitality, she responded with an offer of soup. I deferred. I'm a snob about canned soup. Noticing 2 bags of candy on her dresser, I asked, "Can we sub candy for soup?" "Of course, only a few trick-or-treaters this year." Parched for pleasure, I grabbed fistfuls of Smarties, sweet tarts, and Tootsie Rolls. Between my depleted hunger and sex drives and my disappearing dopamine, that chemical of pleasure, my capacity for hedonic happiness had plummeted. "You're more than welcome to spend the night with us. Anytime you want," Marion offered. I'd become part of the family. Thanking her, I donned my snow pants, down jacket, and spotted seal mittens and headed out to the ambulance for the trip back to the clinic. Waiting for sleep that night, I turned over Mike's question about the value of consciousness. He was referring to an introspective intelligence that arises from awareness of one's own feelings and thoughts, a double-edged sword that cuts differently for each of us. Awareness of ourselves had infused our engagement with one another, so we naturally inculcated awareness in Danielle, hoping that she would make fragrant hay with experiences and the people who touched her. We couldn't anticipate that awareness would backfire, leading to torture rather than transformation. We couldn't know that the riches we bestowed on her would intensify her perception that she was special and that her pain was uniquely formidable, or that self-doubt would weaken her fortitude as she faced the prods that worldly engagement exacts, or that her exquisite sensitivity, compounded by sexual assault, would set the stage for debilitating psychic pain. In death, she would seek the peace that comes with mindlessness. If only she were alive to respond to my interpretation of the zombie dream she had posted. What does it mean that I always end up giving up and offering myself to them or killing myself? Zombies, the undead, could eliminate her consciousness, or she could. I believe her dream reflected her life's intolerable reality and a default to suicide when consciousness became too unbearable. Thank you. If you would like to read more of my writing, I'm at rachelfrazin.com and I've begun blogging. Thank you.